Heavenly Stories.
The sun hung low over the Galilean hills, casting long shadows across the dusty paths where Jesus and his disciples had been traveling. For weeks, they had moved from village to village, Jesus teaching crowds, healing the sick, and stirring hearts with words that felt both ancient and new. The disciples, 12 men bound to him by faith and wonder, sensed a shift in their teacher's demeanor. His words had grown weightier, his gaze more distant, as if he saw beyond the horizon. One evening, as the group camped near Caesarea Philippi, Jesus called 3 of his closest followers aside, Peter, James, and John. His voice was calm but firm, carrying an unspoken urgency. "Come with me," he said, gesturing toward a rugged path leading to a nearby mountain. The others remained behind, exchanging glances, while the chosen 3 followed in silence. The mountain, likely Mount Hermon, loomed tall and solitary, its slope steep and rocky, dusted with patches of grass and wildflowers. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the sounds of the world below fading into a quiet hum. Peter, always quick to speak, wondered aloud why Jesus had chosen this moment, this place. James, more reserved, kept his eyes on the path, while John, the youngest, felt his heart quicken with anticipation. Jesus led the way, his steps sure, his simple robe catching the fading light. The disciples didn't know what awaited them, but they trusted him, even as questions churned in their minds. Hadn't Jesus recently spoken of suffering, of a cross? Yet his face now seemed serene, almost expectant. As they reached a high, secluded spot, the summit opened into a flat clearing, surrounded by jagged rocks and a vast view of the stars beginning to pierce the twilight sky. Jesus stopped and turned to them. "We're here to pray," he said simply, his voice blending with the soft whistle of the mountain wind. The disciples nodded, settling onto the ground, though their weariness from the climb tugged at their limbs. They had prayed with Jesus countless times, but something about this moment felt different, charged, like the air before a storm. Peter glanced at John, who was already kneeling, his eyes fixed on Jesus. James sat cross-legged, his hands resting on his knees, watching their teacher closely. Jesus stepped a few paces away, finding a spot where the moonlight bathed the ground in silver. He knelt, his head bowed, and began to pray. The disciples followed suit, murmuring their own prayers, though their words felt clumsy compared to the stillness of the night. The mountain seemed to hold its breath, as if creation itself were waiting. Peter struggled to focus, his eyelids heavy from the long day. John, too, felt sleep tugging at him, but he fought it, sensing something extraordinary was near. James, ever steady, kept his gaze on Jesus, whose silhouette seemed to glow faintly against the dark rock. Then, without warning, a change came over Jesus. His face began to shine, not with reflected moonlight, but with a light that seemed to come from within, radiant and pure, like the sun breaking through clouds. His robe, once plain and travel-worn, shimmered with a whiteness no fuller could achieve, dazzling and otherworldly. The disciples froze, their prayers forgotten, as the clearing was bathed in a glory that defied the laws of earth. Peter's mouth fell open, John's heart pounded, James gripped the ground to steady himself. This was no ordinary moment. They were witnessing something divine, something that would mark their souls forever. The light pouring from Jesus grew brighter, filling the clearing with a brilliance that made the stars seem dim. Peter, James, and John shielded their eyes, yet they couldn't look away. Jesus stood at the center of the radiance, his face transformed, glowing with a majesty that spoke of eternity. His eyes, usually warm and human, now burned with a holy fire, yet they remained kind, fixed on some unseen presence. The disciples' breath caught in their throats. This was their teacher, yet he was more, far more, than the man they'd followed through dusty villages and crowded synagogues. The air thrummed with power, and the mountain itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the moment. Then, as if the veil between heaven and earth had torn, 2 figures appeared beside Jesus, bathed in the same unearthly light. One was Moses, the lawgiver, his presence commanding yet serene, as if he'd stepped straight from the pages of the Torah. The other was Elijah, the prophet of fire, his form bold and vibrant, a herald of God's voice. The disciples knew them instantly, not by sight but by some deep instinct of the soul. These were the pillars of Israel's faith, Moses, who had met God on Sinai, and Elijah, who had heard the still, small voice. Now they stood with Jesus, their faces radiant, their voices low and earnest, speaking of things the disciples couldn't fully grasp. The conversation was about Jesus' departure, a word that carried the weight of destiny. Moses and Elijah spoke of Jerusalem, of suffering, of a path that would lead to glory through pain. Jesus listened, his expression resolute, his divinity shining through his human form. The disciples, still on their knees, felt like intruders in a sacred council. Peter's mind raced. He wanted to act, to speak, to do something to anchor himself in this overwhelming moment. "Lord," he blurted, his voice trembling, "it's good that we're here. Let me build 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." His words tumbled out, half-formed, born of awe and a desire to hold on to the glory before it faded. James and John exchanged glances, unsure whether to nod or wince at Peter's boldness. They, too, were caught in the spell of the vision, their hearts torn between fear and wonder. The figures before them seemed to belong to another realm, yet Jesus was the center, the one who bound heaven and earth together. The light from him pulsed, steady and warm, yet fierce enough to make their eyes ache. The mountain, the night, the world itself felt small compared to the glory unfolding before them. Then, as Peter's words hung in the air, a new presence descended. A cloud, bright and shimmering, rolled over the summit, enveloping Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. It wasn't like the mists of morning but a living, radiant cloud, pulsing with the same light that came from Jesus. The disciples fell to their faces, trembling, as the cloud surrounded them. It was warm, not cold, and it carried a weight that pressed against their hearts. They felt exposed, as if their very souls were laid bare before the holiness of God. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint echo of Moses and Elijah's voices, now fading. From within the cloud came a voice, deep and resonant, shaking the ground beneath them. "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." The words were not just heard but felt, reverberating in their bones, etching themselves into their minds. It was the voice of the Father, undeniable and eternal, proclaiming Jesus' identity with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Peter clutched the earth, his heart pounding. John wept silently, overwhelmed by love and fear. James bowed lower, his mind reeling with the truth of who Jesus was. As the voice faded, the cloud began to lift, and the light softened. The disciples dared to look up, their eyes stinging, their bodies trembling. Moses and Elijah were gone. Only Jesus remained, his face still glowing faintly, his robe once again plain but somehow carrying the echo of that unearthly whiteness. He stood alone, looking at them with a tenderness that grounded them in the midst of their awe. The mountain summit was quiet now, the radiant cloud gone, the divine visitors vanished. Jesus stood before Peter, James, and John, his face no longer blazing but still carrying a trace of that otherworldly light. The disciples remained on the ground, their bodies heavy with the weight of what they'd seen. The air felt cooler, the stars sharper, as if the world had snapped back into focus after being stretched by glory. Jesus stepped toward them, his sandaled feet soft against the rocky ground, and extended a hand. "Get up," he said gently, his voice familiar yet carrying an authority that echoed the Father's words. "Don't be afraid." Peter lifted his head, his eyes wide, his mouth dry. He wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, but the memory of the voice, "This is my Son," silenced him. John, still trembling, took Jesus' hand and stood, his young face streaked with tears. James rose slowly, his steady nature shaken, his mind grappling with the vision of Moses and Elijah. They had seen Jesus transfigured, radiant with divine glory, and now he stood before them as the man they knew, yet undeniably more. The tension between his humanity and divinity hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Jesus motioned for them to follow, starting down the mountain path. The descent was steep, the rocks loose underfoot, but Jesus moved with the same sure steps as before. The disciples trailed behind, their minds swirling. Peter kept replaying the moment: Moses, Elijah, the cloud, the voice. He wondered what it meant for Jesus' mission, for the cryptic words about suffering and death. John felt a warmth in his chest, a certainty that Jesus was the one they'd been waiting for, the Messiah, though the path ahead seemed shadowed. James, practical as ever, wondered how they could carry this moment back to the world below. "Don't tell anyone what you saw," Jesus said suddenly, his voice cutting through the night. He didn't turn, but his words were clear, firm. "Not until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." The disciples stopped, exchanging puzzled looks. The Son of Man? Raised from the dead? The phrases were heavy, laced with mystery. Peter opened his mouth to ask what he meant, but Jesus raised a hand, silencing him. "Keep this between us for now," he added, his tone softer but unyielding. The disciples nodded, though their hearts burned with the need to share what they'd witnessed. The path wound downward, the world below coming into view, flickering campfires, distant villages, the ordinary life they'd left behind. The contrast was jarring. How could they return to fishing nets and crowded markets after seeing Jesus in glory? The mountain had changed them, marked them, but Jesus' command to stay silent weighed heavily. They walked in silence, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound. The stars above seemed to watch, as if guarding the secret of the night. As they neared the base, Peter finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Lord, was that Elijah? And Moses? Why were they there?" Jesus paused, turning to face them. His eyes held a depth that made Peter feel small yet loved. "They came to speak of what's to come," Jesus said. "My departure, which will happen in Jerusalem." The word departure hung in the air, heavy with meaning. John frowned, sensing it wasn't just a journey but something greater, something final. James nodded slowly, piecing together the prophet's presence with Jesus' talk of suffering. The disciples wanted more answers, but Jesus turned and continued walking, his silhouette blending into the shadows. The mountain was behind them now, but its memory burned in their minds. They had seen the kingdom of God breaking into the world, if only for a moment. Yet the command to stay silent, to wait for the raising of the Son of Man, left them uneasy. What did it mean? And how could they carry this vision in their hearts without speaking of it? By the time they reached the others, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The remaining disciples were stirring, unaware of the glory that had unfolded above. Peter, James, and John exchanged a glance, a silent pact to obey Jesus' command. But the weight of the Transfiguration, the glimpse of divine glory, would never leave them. The camp at the foot of the mountain was stirring as the first rays of dawn painted the sky. The other disciples greeted Jesus, Peter, James, and John with sleepy nods, unaware of the divine encounter that had unfolded above. Peter's eyes were still wide, his mind replaying the radiant figure of Jesus, the sudden appearance of Moses and Elijah, and the voice from the cloud. He wanted to shout it to the others, Judas tending the fire, Andrew mending a sandal, Thomas squinting skeptically at the horizon, but Jesus' command to stay silent held him back. James and John, too, moved quietly, their faces betraying a mix of awe and confusion. The ordinary tasks of breaking camp felt surreal after the glory they'd witnessed. Jesus seemed unchanged, his demeanor calm as he helped roll up a mat and shared bread with the group. Yet the three disciples couldn't unsee the light that had poured from him, the way his face had shone like the sun. They stole glances at him, wondering how the man breaking bread could be the same figure who had stood in divine splendor. The tension between his humanity and divinity gnawed at them, a mystery too vast to grasp. As they packed to leave, Jesus caught Peter's eye, offering a slight nod, as if to say, "Hold fast." Peter nodded back, though his heart churned with questions. The group set out, heading toward the villages of Galilee, but the three disciples lagged behind, their steps heavy. John spoke first, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "Why did he say, 'raised from the dead'?" he asked, glancing at James and Peter. "What's coming in Jerusalem?" James shook his head, his practical mind wrestling with the phrase. "Moses and Elijah spoke of his departure," he said. "It's tied to that, I think." "But, death? And rising?" Peter kicked a stone, frustration bubbling up. "I don't get it," he muttered. "He's the Messiah. He was shining like God himself up there. How can he talk about dying?" Their questions hung unanswered as they followed Jesus through the dusty trails. The crowds began to gather again, drawn by rumors of miracles. A man ran up, begging Jesus to heal his son, and the air filled with the familiar chaos of need and faith. Peter, James, and John threw themselves into the work, but the mountain vision lingered, a secret burning in their chests. They watched Jesus closely, seeing every gesture through the lens of that night, his hands blessing a child, his voice calming a storm of voices. He was their teacher, their friend, but now they knew he was more, the chosen one, the Son. Days passed, and the silence Jesus had commanded grew harder to bear. At night, around the fire, Peter would catch John's eye, both of them wanting to speak of the glory but stopping short. The other disciples noticed their quietness, their occasional far-off stares, but assumed it was exhaustion from the journey. Only Jesus seemed unburdened, teaching and healing with the same steady compassion. Yet his words began to carry darker notes, hints of betrayal, suffering, and a kingdom that would come through sacrifice. One evening, as they camped by a stream, Peter couldn't hold back. He pulled Jesus aside, his voice urgent. "Lord, that night on the mountain, it was you, wasn't it? The Messiah, like Moses said, like Elijah promised. Why keep it secret? Why talk of death when we saw you in glory?" Jesus looked at him, his eyes kind but piercing. "Peter, what you saw was true, but the path to that glory goes through suffering. The Son of Man must give himself, and then he will be raised." Peter frowned, the words clashing with the radiant image in his mind. Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Trust me. The time will come to speak." The weight of the vision settled deeper into the three disciples' hearts. They had seen the kingdom's light, but now they carried the shadow of the cross. The road to Jerusalem loomed, and with it, the mystery of Jesus' words. They clung to the memory of the mountain, a beacon of hope, even as the path ahead grew darker. The Galilean countryside gave way to the rugged paths leading south, toward Jerusalem. Jesus and his disciples moved with purpose, though the air among them was thick with unspoken tension. Peter, James, and John walked with a quiet intensity, their minds anchored to the mountain where they'd seen Jesus transfigured. The memory of his radiant face, the presence of Moses and Elijah, and the voice from the cloud shaped every step they took. Yet Jesus' command to keep silent bound them, even as the vision burned to be shared. The other disciples sensed something different about the three, but their questions went unanswered, met with shrugs or quick changes of subject. Jesus led the way, his pace steady, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He spoke less of miracles now and more of what awaited in Jerusalem. His parables carried a sharper edge, tales of sacrifice and judgment that left the crowds uneasy and the disciples puzzled. To Peter, each word seemed to echo the conversation on the mountain, Moses and Elijah speaking of Jesus' departure. The word haunted him, a riddle he couldn't solve. Was it death? Exile? Something else? He glanced at John, whose youthful face was etched with worry, and James, whose steady gaze hid a storm of questions. They were bound by what they'd seen, yet divided by what they didn't understand. The crowds grew larger as they neared Judea, their clamor for healing and teaching relentless. Jesus moved among them with compassion, but his focus seemed elsewhere, as if drawn to the city that loomed in their future. One afternoon, as they rested under an olive grove, a scribe approached, asking about the Messiah's coming. Jesus' answer was cryptic, pointing to Elijah's role as a forerunner. Peter's ears pricked up, remembering Elijah's figure on the mountain. He wanted to blurt out what he'd seen, to declare that Elijah had already stood with Jesus, but the weight of Jesus' command held his tongue. That night, around a flickering fire, John leaned close to Jesus, his voice barely a whisper. "Lord, on the mountain, the voice said to listen to you. But you speak of suffering, of being raised. Help us understand." Jesus looked into the flames, his face unreadable. "The Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men," he said. "They will kill him, and on the third day, he will rise." The words landed like stones. John's heart sank, Peter's jaw tightened, and James stared into the dark, grappling with the idea of a Messiah who would die. The glory of the mountain seemed distant now, overshadowed by this talk of death. As they continued toward Jerusalem, the disciples' questions multiplied. Why had Moses and Elijah appeared? Was it to confirm Jesus as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets? And why the command to stay silent until he was raised? The vision had been a glimpse of glory, but Jesus' words pointed to a path of pain. Peter, ever impulsive, tried to push the thoughts aside, clinging to the image of Jesus' radiant face. John, more reflective, pondered the voice from the cloud, its command to listen. James, practical and resolute, resolved to follow, even if the way was unclear. The road wound through hills and valleys, each step bringing them closer to the city where everything would change. The disciples didn't know what lay ahead, but the Transfiguration had marked them. They had seen Jesus as he truly was, divine, glorious, the Son of God. Yet he walked with them as a man, heading toward a fate they couldn't fully grasp. The mountain's light lingered in their hearts, a promise that whatever came next, Jesus was the center, the chosen one, whose path would lead through darkness to a glory they could only begin to imagine. Jerusalem's walls rose in the distance, a city of stone and promise, as Jesus and his disciples drew near. The Transfiguration, though days passed, remained a vivid flame in the minds of Peter, James, and John. They had seen Jesus in divine glory, flanked by Moses and Elijah, bathed in light that outshone the sun. The voice from the cloud, "This is my Son, my chosen one," still echoed in their souls, a divine seal on Jesus' identity. Yet his repeated warnings of betrayal, death, and rising again cast a shadow over that vision. The disciples walked in silence, their hearts torn between the mountain's glory and the looming uncertainty of Jerusalem. Peter wrestled most visibly with the tension. He was a man of action, eager to proclaim what he'd seen, to rally the others around the truth of Jesus' divinity. But the command to stay silent until the Son of Man was raised held him back. He stole glances at Jesus, who walked ahead, his face set like flint toward the city. The same hands that had glowed with heavenly light now carried a staff, dust clinging to his calloused fingers. How could the Son of God face death? Peter's faith was fierce, but his understanding faltered, caught between the Transfiguration's promise and the cross Jesus spoke of. John, younger and more introspective, carried the vision differently. He replayed every detail, the radiant cloud, the voices of Moses and Elijah, the Father's command to listen. To him, the Transfiguration was a call to trust, even when Jesus' path seemed to defy reason. He watched his teacher closely, noting the tenderness in his eyes as he blessed a child or the resolve in his voice when he spoke of what lay ahead. John sensed that the glory on the mountain was a foretaste of something greater, though the path to it was veiled in mystery. James, steady and pragmatic, bore the vision as a duty. He had seen Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel's hopes, confirmed by the law and the prophets. Yet the talk of suffering challenged his expectations of a triumphant Messiah. As they neared Jerusalem, he felt a growing resolve to stand by Jesus, whatever came. The Transfiguration had shown him the end, glory, power, the kingdom, but the road to it was steep, and he braced himself for what lay ahead. The other disciples, unaware of the mountain's events, sensed the weight on their companions. They asked questions, but Peter, James, and John deflected, bound by Jesus' command. The group entered Jerusalem amid Passover crowds, the air buzzing with expectation. Jesus' actions, cleansing the temple, teaching with authority, drew both followers and enemies. Peter, James, and John watched, the memory of the Transfiguration sharpening their perception. Every word, every act, seemed charged with divine purpose, yet the shadow of the cross grew darker. In the days that followed, the vision sustained them through chaos. When Jesus was arrested, Peter's denial was laced with guilt, the memory of the radiant Christ haunting him. John stood at the cross, seeing the man he'd followed bleed, yet clinging to the mountain's promise. James, though shaken, held fast to the voice that had called Jesus the Son. The Transfiguration had been a glimpse of resurrection, a light to carry them through the darkness of Good Friday. When Jesus rose, the command to stay silent lifted. Peter preached boldly at Pentecost, the glory of the mountain fueling his words. John wrote of the Word made flesh, his gospel steeped in the light he'd seen. James, until his martyrdom, led with a quiet strength born of that night. The Transfiguration was no mere moment but a cornerstone of their faith, a revelation that Jesus was both man and God, whose suffering led to eternal glory.